Interracial marriage.
With lots of information about Virginia Loving from how interracial marriage bans ended. Loving versus Virginia.
Starting with Loving in Virginia, our story starts Central Point, Virginia, summer 1958. Mildred Jeter discovers she was pregnant. At that time, it was still illegal for interracial marriage in the state of Virginia.
So the Lovings go to Washington, D.C., where interracial marriage is legal, and they tied the knot on June 2nd, 1956, and they returned home to live together. Shortly after, the local sheriff ordered a late-night raid of their home in the middle of the night, burst into the home and bedroom, trying to catch them doing so, which was illegal. They were actually sleeping and were woken to be arrested for violating Virginia's Racial Integrity Act.
The Racial Integrity Act is a law passed in Virginia in 1924. The new law prohibited interracial marriage.
The Lovings went to court, they pled guilty, and the judge sentenced them to 1 year in prison, but then suspended them as long as they moved out of Virginia and never returned as a married couple for 25 years on January 6, 1959.
They moved to Washington, D.C., the same city where they got married, eventually sneaked back to Virginia, but for 5 years they lived in D.C. and basically hated it. As Mildred and Richard's family grew in D.C., they missed their family back in Virginia. In 1964, tired of living in exile, Mildred wrote to Attorney General Robert Kennedy. Kennedy referred her letter to the American Civil Liberties Union, or ACLU, who then reached to the Lovings. The ACLU volunteered cooperating attorneys Bernie Cohen and Philip Hitchcock filed on motion on behalf of the Lovings to the Virginia-Carolina County Circuit Court, requesting to allow the marriage since denying it broke the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Act.
The ACLU expected all the pushback from the state of Virginia, so they were all well prepared to appeal to the Supreme Court. The Lovings, who were done being in the spotlight, decided to stay home on April 10, 1967, when the court heard oral arguments. By that time, 9 years had passed since they got married on June 12, 1967. The court announced it had anonymously sided with the Lovings, overturning their convictions and ruling Virginia's interracial ban as unconstitutional.
Chief Justice Earl Warren wrote the opinion which stated Virginia's Racial Integrity Act went against both the Due Process Clause and Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, said Warren. The 14th Amendment requires that freedom of choice to marry not be restricted by insidious racial discrimination. Under our Constitution, the freedom to marry or not marry a person of another race resides with the individual and cannot be infringed by the state. The court also argued that laws banning interracial marriage were straight up racist, with the purpose to keep white supremacy going. On June 12, 1967, the Supreme Court issued an unanimous 9-0 decision in the Lovings' favor.
Despite the court's unanimous opinions in Loving versus Virginia, interracial marriage bans remained in the books in several states. The authorities couldn't enforce them now. The last state to get them off the books was Alabama in 2000. After Loving versus Virginia, the number of interracial marriages steadily increased across the United States. In 1963, 3% of new marriages in the country were interracial. By 2015, it was up to 17%. Loving versus Virginia also paved the way the legality of same-sex marriage several decades later. There were a lot of anonymous Supreme Court decisions in the 1950s and 1960s because of the original court decision with the Lovings. This graph shows info how interracial marriages steadily increased throughout the years.
There are many interracial couples that have benefited from the Lovings court case.